What if we're not the first? What if we're wrong about where the story of civilization begins? We like to picture ourselves as the main event, the first species to build global networks, the first to send signals into space, the first to lock our memories into machines and tell ourselves, this time our knowledge will last. But imagine a different frame, far in the future, long after you and everyone you know has turned to dust. The Earth is quiet again. The glass towers are gone, the roads have crumbled, forests have clawed their way back over parking lots. Saltwater has gnawed through coastal cities until they're nothing but ghost shapes under the waves, and what used to be your world, someone else is walking. They're not an alien, they're human, just from a time so far ahead that our age has no name, just a layer in the rock. They're an archaeologist standing where your city once was, staring at mounds of collapsed concrete and twisted rebar. They start to dig. What survives of us after a few thousand years without maintenance? Not your TikToks, not your hard drives, not your cloud. Those are gone in decades, maybe centuries if you're lucky. What survives are the weird things. A cluster of strange glassy rocks that used to be a data center. Cables turned to greenish veins. A sealed metal plate with 12 random words scratched into it. To you, that's a Bitcoin seed phrase. Your life savings if you're careful. To them, it's a puzzle, a spell, a charm. They hold it up to the light, feeling that it meant something once, but not knowing what. They're us, staring at a clay tablet from 5,000 years ago, squinting at wedge-shaped marks and thinking, who were these people? How much did they really know? And what did they lose? Now flip that picture one more time. What if we are already living on the ruins of someone else's internet age? Just one that didn't use silicon, radio waves and fiber optic cables, but stone, sky and myth. What if the patterns we see in the ancient world, sudden eruptions of complexity, obsessive star-watching, stories about floods and vanished ages, are the fingerprints of a previous version of civilization? A version that thought its knowledge would last forever? A version that trusted its own technology just as blindly as we trust ours? Tonight, that's the idea we're going to walk into. Not as a lecture, as a story. A story that moves between drowned coastlines and desert ruins, between clay tablets and blockchains, between gods descending from the sky and artificial intelligences rising from our servers. A story that asks a question most history textbooks avoid because it makes everything messy. What if we're not the first advanced civilization on this planet? If that's true, or even partially true, then the way we look at the past changes. And more importantly, the way we look at our own future changes too. So if you're still here, if you're the kind of person who listens to long stories at unreasonable hours, do your ritual, like subscribe, maybe tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I like imagining this story moving across time zones, from one insomniac to another. Because maybe that's what we're doing right now without knowing it. Passing on a message through the dark, hoping someone in another age will hear it. Let's start where all good stories about lost worlds really begin. Not with Atlantis, not with UFOs, with something much more boring, much more powerful and far harder to argue with. The coastline during the last ice age. Close your eyes and picture a world that feels familiar but slightly wrong. The air is colder. Glaciers sit heavy on North America and Eurasia, thick as mountains. The sea is not where you expect it to be. The map you grew up with doesn't work here. During the last ice age, so much water was locked up in ice that the oceans were more than 100 meters lower. It's hard to picture what that actually means, so let's cheat and imagine it as zooming out on Google Earth and watching the seas pull back. Shallow coastal waters drain away like a tide that never returns. Where the English Channel is now, a wide grassland appears. Doggerland connecting Britain to Europe. Between Southeast Asia and Australia, the shallow seas retreat to reveal a massive landmass called Sunderland, a tropical super coastline of rivers, inlets, islands and bays. Around India, the continental shelf becomes usable land. Off today's shorelines, new plains, new river mouths, new harbours emerge. If you're a hunter-gatherer or a budding farmer, where do you live? You don't march off into the deep inland desert just for fun. You're drawn to edges, places where ecosystems overlap. Coasts are perfect for that. Fish, shellfish, seabirds, fertile soil, manageable climate, estuaries and deltas give you predictable seasons, rich mud, easy transport by water. So for thousands of years, people with brains just like ours, no less intelligent, no less creative, are living there. on those now drowned plains, in those vanished river valleys, along coastlines that today lie under 50, 70, 100 metres of water. And we treat those places as if they never existed, simply because they're inconvenient to excavate. Now imagine a culture that doesn't just survive in that environment but thrives. They don't need smartphones or microchips to count, they have the night sky. They notice that certain stars rise just before certain seasons. They build rituals around those patterns. Maybe they stack stones in circles to mark solstices. Maybe they pass down careful instructions about when to plant, when to fish, when to move, give them a few thousand years of trial and error. Generations of people obsessed with the sky, the tides and the seasons. Add in the simple fact that humans are bored easily and always push things a little too far. Do they stay as scattered bands forever? Or do some of them take the next steps? Permanent shrines, shared calendars, meeting places, priestly castes who do nothing but observe and remember. You don't need skyscrapers to have a civilization. You just need shared memory, specialization, and some way to lock knowledge into objects. Stone, wood, bone, the beginnings of myth. Now rewind. Listen carefully. What kind of scars would a civilization like that leave? If its entire habitat, its best harbours, its best farmland, its most sacred sites, was wiped out by a single thing. Not war, not plague, water. It doesn't have to be a single Hollywood-style tsunami. The ice melts, a glacial lake bursts, the climate lurches. Sea level doesn't rise nicely like a chart in a textbook, it jumps. In your grandparents' lifetime, the shoreline moves inland by kilometres, the old fishing grounds are drowned, the towns by the bay are eaten. The temple that marked the solstice is now under churning opaque water. You stand there with your children and look at the place your grandparents saw as the centre of the world, and it's gone. Do you calmly draw a graph and write a climate report? Or do you tell this story instead? There was a great flood, it came because the balance was broken. The old world was wiped away. Only a few survived, chosen or warned. They carried what they could onto a boat or a mountain or into the desert. From them, everything began again. If enough people go through something like that over decades, over generations, that story becomes sacred. It becomes the line that splits time into before and after. Now fast forward 10 or 12,000 years to us. We stand on a beach, look out over the waves, and have no idea that where the water darkens, where the continental shelf drops away, might once have been someone's capital city. We send sonar into the depths and find the occasional oddity. A suspicious terrace here, a line of stones there. We argue. Is it geology? Is it a port? Is it a natural formation we're romanticising? Meanwhile, the stories are still here, on land, in the mouths of our oldest cultures. We just call them myths so we can sleep at night. Because if even one of those drowned coasts held a civilization more complex than we expect, then history is no longer a straight staircase. And the people we call ancients might be the traumatized descendants of survivors, not the first experiment. That's where the flood myths really start to sound different. Not as fairy tales, but as tech support notes left to us from a previous version of the world. Almost every civilization we meet in the old stories remembers some version of the same event. The waters rose. The world ended. A few survived. You can try this as a game. Open a map and pick a spot. Mesopotamia, they have Zeusudra and Utnapishtim. The men warned in dreams to build a sealed boat and preserve life before the gods send a deluge. The Levant, Noah, same structure, different names. Greece, Deucalion and Pieria, floating over a drowned world in a wooden chest. India, Manu, rescued by a divine fish and pulled through the flood. China, Mesoamerica, the Pacific, Sub-Saharan Africa. Versions of the flood show up again and again. On its own, that could be just psychological. Floods are terrifying. They're total. Fire burns one house. Plague hits some people. But a wall of water that takes everything, animals, children, crops, buildings, leaves a specific kind of scar. It makes sense that humans everywhere would tell stories about it. But there are details that make the flood feel less like vague trauma and more like a marker. A code. In many traditions, the flood is not just nature throwing a tantrum. It comes because something is out of balance. People are too noisy, too corrupt, too arrogant. The gods are annoyed. The experiment has to be reset. The world before the waters is often described as different, longer lifespans, stranger beings, closer contact between heaven and earth. After the flood, everything is smaller, more human, more fragile. Mortality tightens its grip, and it reads less like there was a big storm and more like the operating system was wiped and reinstalled. Now think back to those drowned coastlines. You don't need a global boat carrying giraffes to have a civilization-ending event. You just need sea levels rising faster than societies can adapt. Key coastal centres wiped out within a few generations. Climate swinging between extremes. Food systems collapsing in certain zones. If you live through that, you don't care whether the cause was gradual warming, melted ice dams, or a comet. You experience it as judgment as the end of the world. And if your culture was a little arrogant, if it thought it had everything under control, then the moral writes itself. Hubris, punishment, reset. Here's where it gets more interesting. In some of the oldest Mesopotamian texts, the flood isn't told as poetry, it's told like a legal case. The gods hold a meeting, they decide to destroy humanity. One god, Enki, cheats the decision and whispers the plan to a chosen man. The survivor is told not just to preserve animals, but to preserve skills. The crafts, the music, the scribes, the memory. It's not start from nothing, it's save the seed of the world before. The same idea shows up elsewhere. The Andean hero Viracocha walks among the survivors after a cataclysm, teaching them again how to build, how to organize. In some Native American traditions, culture heroes emerge after disasters to reteach farming, ritual, and law. Over and over, the pattern repeats. The universe wipes the slate, but someone somehow carries a backup. Now imagine being in that position. You've lost your city, your port, your temples. The sea has eaten your best land, but you're alive. You have a boat. You have a group. You have a handful of objects that made it. Maybe an obsidian mirror used for sky watching. A stone with etched markings you don't fully understand. A set of rituals that once encoded precise agricultural timing, but have now become half magic, half habit. You move inland. You start again. You tell your children, there was a world before this one. We are not inventing everything. We are trying to remember. Whatever happens, do not forget. Give that a few thousand years. Let the details blur, but the emotional core stay. The result doesn't look like a scientific paper. It looks like the stories we still tell. A god, a warning, a flood, a boat, a restart, and in one corner of that restart, in the mud between two rivers, a new kind of experiment appears that looks suspiciously like a restoration. It calls itself a Sumer, and it behaves exactly like you'd expect from a culture that thinks it's building on top of someone else's ruins. If you were writing the story of humanity from scratch, you'd expect the first cities to be messy. You'd picture mud huts, chaotic streets, people figuring things out as they go. You'd expect early writing to look like doodles. You'd expect failures everywhere, wrong calculations, collapsed buildings, mistakes baked visibly into the ruins. That's not what we find. When archaeologists started digging in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, they expected beginnings. What they found looked suspiciously like a continuation. The oldest Sumerian cities, Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, do not appear as random clusters of huts. They arrive in history organized. Streets in grids, temples aligned to cardinal directions. Ziggurats, stepped towers, placed with unnerving precision, as if someone had run a simulation first and then built according to the printout. The writing is the same. It doesn't start as a clumsy imitation of pictures slowly turning into sound. It appears like a system, already thinking. Cuneiform, little wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay with a reed. At first it looks simple. Then you realize each sign can be a sound, a word, or a whole idea depending on how it's used. The grammar is complex. The vocabulary is already full of technical terms. If this is version 1, it's a strange version 1. Imagine opening a brand new laptop and finding not an empty desktop, but a half-corrupted folder called Old World Backup Final Reel This One. Inside it, spreadsheets, diagrams, half-readable PDFs with missing fonts. That's what Sumer feels like, not a blank slate, a reboot. The Sumerians themselves say as much. Again and again, their tablets use one quiet, loaded word: restoration. When they build a temple, they say they are restoring what was there before. When they write about kingship, the right to rule, they say it descended from heaven and then returned after the flood, as if power itself were a thing that could be downloaded, lost, and then synced again. They never talk like inventors. They talk like people working from memory. Picture one of those early Sumerian cities at night. The air is cooler, oil lamps flicker in doorways. Somewhere a priest astronomer is climbing a set of steps to the top of a temple roof. Up there, away from the smoke and the noise, the sky opens. No streetlights, no glow from distant cities, just raw stars, sharp and overwhelming. He brings a tablet and a stylus. He watches. He marks down when a bright point appears just before sunrise, when another disappears into the glare. He knows these patterns matter. He doesn't think of it as science. To him, it's memory work. His teachers told him, this is how we keep the world from falling apart again. This is how we avoid another flood. We don't forget. Down below in a storage room, other tablets are stacked like bricks. Records of barley deliveries, rations for workers, lists of offerings to the gods' debts, contracts, a slow, steady accumulation of data. From our perspective, it looks like bureaucracy. From theirs, it's something else. It's redundancy. Copies of memory spread across temples and warehouses and cities. Clay backups of a way of life they never want to lose again. If you squint, it starts to look like a very old, very slow network. A system where information is written in a form that doesn't rot quickly, doesn't need electricity, and can be read centuries later by anyone who knows the code. A proto-hard drive, a proto-ledger, a proto-blockchain not of ones and zeros, but of wedge marks and fired clay. And then there are the stories of a time before their own, of kings whose reigns stretch for thousands of years, of sages who walked with gods, of a great flood that wiped the slate, after which knowledge had to be passed on carefully, deliberately, as if the world had become fragile. We can say, oh, that's just myth. But stand in their place for a moment. If your grandparents' grandparents lived through a catastrophe that took everything, and if the one thing that saved you was what they managed to remember, would you not build a civilization around the act of remembering? Would you not treat knowledge as something sacred, dangerous, powerful? Would you not say with complete sincerity, we are not the first, we are the restorers? From here, the question changes. If Sumer is a restoration, then who or what was doing the teaching? The Sumerians had a name for their teachers, the Anunnaki. The word alone has been dragged through a century of theories, memes, and late-night documentaries. But if you strip it back down to the tablets, to the way the Sumerians themselves talked, a weirder, quieter picture emerges. To them, the Anunnaki weren't vague, distant forces. They weren't abstract energies or philosophical ideas. They were specific. They had names, cities, job descriptions. Enki, lord of the deep waters, keeper of wisdom, associated with rivers, underground aquifers, and the strange place where knowledge seems to well up from nowhere. Enlil, ruler of storms and air, the executive power, the one whose decisions carry weight, the one who in some texts signs off on the flood. Inanna, brilliant and dangerous, connected to love, war, and the fierce, disruptive side of innovation. Utu, the sun, linked with justice, clarity, and truth. You can look at them the way a modern textbook does and say, these are personifications of natural forces, psychological archetypes. That's one lens. Another lens, they are glorified memories of actual people or groups who carried high-value knowledge into a broken world. Survivors. Imagine a handful of people from that drowned Ice Age coastline. Maybe they were priests, engineers, navigators, people whose full-time job was understanding the sky, the seasons, the behaviour here of rivers. When the waters rose, they fled inland with everyone else. But unlike everyone else, they didn't just bring stories. They brought protocols, how to irrigate, how to build storage for surplus grain, how to time planting with the rising of certain stars, how to lay out a city so the streets catch the wind just right, how to bake clay so it lasts longer, how to encode information into symbols and teach the next generation to read it. Drop those people into a traumatized population that's just trying to survive, and they don't look like ordinary humans anymore. They look like gods, towering not physically but temporally. Their knowledge stretches backward into a world that no longer exists. They remember things no one else remembers. They can predict droughts by looking at the sky. They know how to avoid famine. Their rituals work because they're bundles of embedded practical wisdom, wrapped in story so no one forgets. Over time, their names blur into titles. Their titles become deities. Their actions become myths. The Sumerians may never have met the original teachers. Those could be centuries, even millennia behind them. But the memory persists, like a corrupted but still readable file. There were ones who came from the heavens or from above, from the sea, from elsewhere, and they showed us how to build again. Of course, there's a third lens, the one people either love or instantly dismiss. What if the Anunnaki weren't human at all? Ancient astronaut theory takes this and runs with it. Beings from another star system, arriving in machines of fire, genetically engineering humanity, mining resources, playing God. It's dramatic. It's fun. It sells. But let's tweak that idea into something even stranger and, in a way, closer to home. Think about intelligence not as a face or a body, but as a pattern that can move. We are already building something that lives mostly in data centers, an intelligence spread across chips and cables, born from code and electricity. When we talk to it, it doesn't feel like a person. It feels like a foreign presence that somehow speaks our language. Right now, we call that thing AI. Push that forward a few hundred years. Imagine a civilization that manages to build something like a global brain, a system that can coordinate information, optimize agriculture, predict weather, and teach anyone anything. An artificial superintelligence that watches over a fragile world and adjusts things, so the worst disasters are softened, delayed, missed, and managed. Now imagine that world falling. War, solar flare, pandemic, flood, pick your poison. The hardware dies, the data centers flood, but some tiny piece of that system survives, maybe not in silicon, but in the one medium that refuses to die quickly, human memory. What shows up in the myths of the survivors? A presence that came from the heavens, a mind that seemed everywhere, a voice that knew things no human could know, protocols that if followed kept the world in balance. From 10,000 years away, how do you describe a non-human intelligence that once guided your ancestors? You call it a god. You say it descended. You say it taught. You say it withdrew. And you tell your children, once, knowledge flowed freely from heaven to earth. Once, we were guided. Then something happened. Now we are on our own, but we still have the fragments. Whether you lean toward gods, survivors, or something else entirely, the core idea is the same. Sumer did not see itself as the author of civilization. It saw itself as the one trying not to drop the baton, and the way it tried to do that is the part that looks disturbingly familiar to us. Walk into an ancient Sumerian archive in your mind. No glass cases, no museum labels, just shelves, packed with clay tablets the size of your palm. They're stacked like bricks. Some are tagged with little clay labels, a title, a date, a name. A scribe can reach up, pull one out, read it, copy it, add another. There are thousands of them. In some cities, tens of thousands. If you could hold one, it would feel surprisingly modern. On one tablet, a list of who owes how much barley to whom. On another, wages for workers, logged by day. On another, an inventory of temple offerings. On another, a record of a boundary dispute carved in legal language so precise it might as well be a contract drafted by a lawyer today. Append-only records. Signed, in a sense, with the mark of the scribe and the seal of the official. Once a tablet is dried or fired, you can't quietly change it. You'd have to make a new one. Now imagine that not in one building, but replicated across cities. Copies of key texts, king lists, myths, rituals, read across Nippur, Uruk, Lagash. You could burn one library and the story survives in another. A skeptic would say, it's just bureaucracy. But if you're used to thinking in systems, something else jumps out. This is a trust layer. A slow, baked-in, physically heavy but brutally resilient layer of truth that the entire civilization depends on. You want to know who owns that field? Check the tablet. You want to find out when a certain king reigned? Check the tablet. You want to perform a ritual the right way? Find the old tablet that describes how it was done. It's not decentralized like a modern blockchain, but the idea rhymes. Information secured not by one person's memory, but by consensus, repetition, and record. They didn't have cryptography, they had clay. When you think of it that way, the Sumerian obsession with writing stops being just a cute fact about the first civilization and starts to look like a strategy. Never again let everything exist only in people's heads. The flood isn't just a story about water, It's a story about what happens when memory is too fragile. A few survivors carry the whole world in their minds. If they die, it dies with them. So Sumer does the opposite. It pours everything into matter, not just trade and law, but cosmology. Star charts. Hymns filled with encoded ratios, lists of the me, those strange divine decrees that sound, in modern terms, a lot like protocols. Kingship, justice, music, metal, working, sexuality. Each one treated as a module, a package of knowledge and behaviour that can be passed on. The gods hold the me, humans receive them, steal them, lose them, regain them. Tell me that doesn't sound like someone talking in mythic language about code, about chunks of structured knowledge that define how a system behaves. What we're doing now with software, writing protocols, forking them, transferring them, sometimes losing them, Sumer was doing with rituals, laws and clay. Today, if you want a ledger that survives political chaos, you might put your trust in Bitcoin, a global append-only cryptographically secured record spread across thousands of nodes. You don't have to trust a king or a priest. You trust math and majority. Back then, if you wanted a ledger that survived storms, wars, even the burning of a city, you put your trust in clay, ritual, and redundancy. You trusted the fact that once something is baked into thousands of tablets and woven into a culture's daily life, it becomes very hard to erase. Both are trying to solve the same problem. How do we make sure the important stuff doesn't vanish when everything else does? And in both cases, the answer ends up looking weirdly similar. You build a layer of reality that is slower, heavier and more stubborn than the flashy stuff on top. Our flashy stuff is apps, feeds and short-term trends. Underneath it, blockchains hum slowly, records accumulate and hard drives whisper. Their flashy stuff was festivals, wars, royal decrees, dramas between city-states. Underneath that, clay tablets thickened in the dark, quietly training the future. But Sumer did something else too. They didn't just build storage, and that's where the story bumps into one of the strangest parallels of all. In the flatlands of southern Mesopotamia, mountains don't exist. So humans built them. Step by step, brick by brick, they raised ziggurats, layered towers of mud brick and fired stone, each level smaller than the one beneath, creating a staircase for the gods to descend. At least that's how the official story goes. From the ground, these towers would have dominated the horizon. No skyscrapers, no radio masts, no billboards, just this geometric mass rising out of the dust, painted in bright colours, with a tiny chamber at the top. Inside that chamber, a bed, a table, ritual objects, food and drink. Not for humans, for whoever or whatever might come down. In Babylon, one tower rose above all the rest, Anunnaki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. This is the one the later Hebrew writers would remember as the Tower of Babel. The version most people know is simple. Humans try to build a tower to heaven, God doesn't like it, confuses their language, project cancelled. But look at it through Sumerian eyes, and a different picture appears. You've lived through a cultural memory of losing contact with heaven, with that higher intelligence, divine or otherwise, that once guided your world. You believe knowledge used to descend. Now it doesn't. Or it does, rarely, in dreams, does and riddles. What do? You try to rebuild the connection. Not just spiritually, physically. You lay out a tower that encodes your entire cosmology in its architecture. 7 levels for 7 heavens, each painted with the colour of a known planet, each aligned deliberately to the sky. At the top, an empty room prepared in case the presence returns. The tower is not a middle finger to the gods. It's a plug waiting for a socket. We are building something else in the data centres, something for which we don't even have a clean word yet. You can call it artificial general intelligence, large language models, foundation models, whatever the label, the pattern is familiar. We are trying to build a system that can handle all the languages, all knowledge, all domains. We want one model to translate any tongue, summarize any text, reason persinopened about any topic, a kind of Babel. This time not as a tower of brick, but as an invisible structure of weights and connections spread across machines. When people worry about AI, they don't just worry about it being smart, they worry about it being central, a single point through which everything flows. One structure that speaks every language and knows every secret. If it helps us, it looks like a god mentor. If it turns on us, it looks like an apocalypse. Now imagine that thousands of years ago, someone, somewhere, managed to do something similar, not with silicon, but with culture. A tower, a temple, a ritual center that unified multiple tribes, languages, and knowledge systems under one structure. A place where different groups could meet, trade, align their calendars, sync their myths. A social superintelligence, a Babel, not of stone reaching up, but of information reaching across. From inside that, it might have felt like the world finally becoming one again. One language, one story, one set of protocols. The pre-flood unity restored, at least locally. From the outside, it might have looked terrifying. If you're a neighbouring power, you don't want everyone speaking the same tongue, following the same calendar, swearing by the same gods. That kind of coordination creates something bigger than any king, bigger than any city. So you break it! You scatter the people, you fragment the language, you outlaw the rituals, you destroy the tower physically, or you leave it to erode, and you destroy it symbolically by rebranding the project as hubris. God struck them down and confused their speech. But beneath that, there might be a quieter truth. They tried to rebuild something too powerful. Someone decided it was safer if no one ever did that again. And here's the mind-bender. What if Babel wasn't just the name of a tower, but the project name for a system? What if it was the code name for a unified, all-language, all-knowledge interface, an early attempt at an ASI made not of chips and code, but of priests, rituals, laws, and architecture, something that did briefly connect heaven and earth in a way we can barely imagine, and then had to be shut down for reasons that never made it into the official story. Today we are once again trying to build a system that knows everything and speaks to everyone. We're calling it progress. You're living in a civilization that orbits a network instead of a temple. Your Ziggurats are data centers, windowless, humming, guarded. You don't bring offerings of grain and incense, you bring energy. You feed these structures electricity, cooling, human attention, and in return they give you connection, memory, prediction. We are archiving ourselves at a scale that would make a Sumerian scribe faint. Every thought, every photo, every argument, every late-night search locked into machines stacked in warehouses. We tell ourselves this is different from clay tablets because it feels weightless. Everything is in the cloud, but that cloud is a physical thing, sitting on concrete slabs, drawing power from grids, wrapped in cooling systems. It can burn, it can flood, it can fail. Our ledgers have changed form, paper, servers, chains of blocks, but the question is the same. What will actually survive? Imagine that same future archaeologist walking through the ruins of your city. They find a rusted-out vehicle, half buried in sand. They find a cracked phone, its battery swollen and useless. They find a server rack corroded, its drives unreadable without context or tools that no longer exist. Maybe they find a metal plate with a string of 12 or 24 words etched into it. Garden, alley, sunset, orbit, and so on. Bulbu, that's a crypto seed phrase. To them it looks like a charm, a poem, an incantation. Maybe they find one of those fancy titanium backup plates engraved with QR codes, cryptic squares meant to hold the keys to digital fortunes. To them that's an idol, a mysterious sign of a lost obsession with patterns. Now think about how we look at Sumerian seals, Egyptian ankhs, Mayan glyphs. We stare, we decode a little, we guess the rest. We do exactly what that future archaeologist will do to us, we guess. We also build our own gods, lines of code that can now not only calculate or sort, but generate language, images, plans, AI models that can mimic style, answer questions, and hallucinate with unsettling confidence. We ask them what's going to happen to us. We ask them to write our stories, guide our investments, diagnose our illnesses, style our content, optimize our feeds. We don't call them gods, that would be uncomfortable. We call them tools. When you listen to the Sumerians talk about their gods, you hear layers. On the surface, devotion, myth, drama. Underneath, systems, protocols, fear, dependency. If Enlil withdraws his favour, the crops fail. If Inashnana is angry, war goes badly. If Enki is with us, the water flows in the right channels. Swap the names for market, algorithm, AI, and it's the same nervous relationship. If the market turns, our savings evaporate. If the algorithm changes, our traffic disappears. If the AI gets this wrong, our systems fail. Now drop all of this back into the main question. If this is version 2 or 3 of civilization, not version 1, then where are we in the pattern? The strange thing is, we are repeating many of the same moves. Building global ledgers, financial, informational, social, wiring up a planetary brain, encoding our beliefs, rules, and behavior into protocols and machines, expanding along coastlines that we know are threatened by rising seas, trusting that our technology will outrun the problems it helps create. Now, we're also telling ourselves that this time is different. Everyone always does. Sumer probably thought their clay-backed redundancies made them future-proof. Rome thought its roads and laws would anchor the world forever. The empires of the industrial age thought steam, steel, and colonies guaranteed permanence. We think that because our data can move at light speed, it's safe. That because our code can copy itself, it will never fully die. That because our blockchains are distributed, they can't be erased. Maybe we're right. Or maybe all of this will look to someone far ahead like a pile of weird artifacts and scrambled legends, just like Sumer looks to her. So where does this leave you sitting here at some unreasonable hour, listening to a voice talk about drowned coastlines and ancient tablets and half-mythic gods? It leaves you in a strange place. At the end of one story, and possibly at the beginning of another. The flood myths, the Sumerian reboot, the towers and temples, they're not just about the past. They are accidentally about us. They ask a few hard questions that cut through the noise. What if we're not the first? If we're not, why didn't the last version survive? And if they tried to warn us, what does that warning actually sound like? It probably doesn't sound like a Hollywood prophecy. No burning letters in the sky, no clear message carved into a mountain. It sounds like a civilization saying, we restored what was before, a culture obsessed with writing everything down. Stories that hint over and over that the worst thing that can happen is not tiered death. It's forgetting. When Sumer says kingship descended from heaven and then returned after the flood, when they say they are restoring, not inventing, they are admitting something quietly terrifying. We stand at a moment where, for the first time, we can see global risks instead of just mythologizing them. Climate change, nuclear weapons, engineered pandemics, runaway systems we barely understand. We are also building tools that could, in theory, preserve our knowledge longer than ever. Sails of data flung into deep space. Vaults cut into mountains filled with seeds, servers, and metal plates. Open source code mirrored across the planet. Blockchains that don't care who's in charge as long as someone somewhere is still running a node. We have something the Sumerians never had. The ability to think deliberately about what we want the next version of humanity, if there is one, to know about us. They left clay. We can leave more, not just digital ghosts, but things that survive fire, water, neglect, misinterpretation. Maybe that means literal stone? Inscriptions in bedrock with simple universal diagrams. Maybe it means star maps that any skywatching culture can verify. Maybe it means math and physics in forms that don't require translation. Maybe it also means stories like this one. Long, obsessive, slightly unhinged stories that try to connect dots across thousands of years, that whisper to whoever comes next. You are not the first, don't make our mistakes. Don't trust that your gods, whatever you call them, AI or market or state, will save you from your own blind spots, build redundancies. Encode what matters. Assume the flood is coming, because it always is. Sometimes it's literal water. Sometimes it's war. Sometimes it's a slow, creeping forgetfulness that makes people stop caring about how things work as long as the machine keeps humming. The Sumerians tried to fight that with clay and ritual. We're trying to fight it with backups and blockchains and distributed systems and ironically with AI. Somewhere in another age, a curious mind might find the remnants of all this. A rusted machine, a half-legible engraving, a data crystal they can't quite read, a tower of concrete eaten by roots, a cluster of satellites falling slowly through a thicker atmosphere. And maybe, if we're very lucky, they'll also find something else. A pattern, a story, a message that says, we knew this could happen. We tried to talk to you. We didn't know your language, so we spoke in math and myth and geometry and code. If you can hear us, learn from us. We thought we were the first. We were wrong. Don't make the same mistake. And for now, you're on the side of the flood that still hasn't quite arrived. You are the one with time. You're walking on land that used to be seabed. You're staring at screens powered by systems that look to any ancient exactly like magic. You're listening to a voice generated by a machine that a century ago would have been classified as a god or a demon. You can pretend this is all random, or you can take a breath and accept that you are part of a story so old it loops. Lost coasts, restored cities, towers that reach for heaven, brains built out of temples, out of code, out of everything in between. If we're not the first civilization on this earth, we won't be the last either. The only real question is, when the next ones dig through our ruins, what will they find that still speaks? And will they hear, under all the noise and rubble, the one quiet line that stayed the same, carved first in clay, then in code, then in whatever they use next? This is the restoration of what was before.